So like a big thing with Nietzsche is this idea of the will to power, right? This like fundamental drive for growth and self-mastery.
Right. It's kind of the engine of his whole philosophy.
Totally. And so, for Nietzsche, love is not necessarily just this like soft, fuzzy feeling.
No.
It's tied to this like fundamental drive.
Exactly.
So how does that play out like in his actual views on love?
Well, you see it even in how he understands emotions in general.
Yeah.
In Beyond Good and Evil, he argues that even our feelings involve a sense of command.
Command.
Yeah, like a forcefulness.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you apply that to love, he's suggesting that it's a way of affirming and valuing and choosing someone.
Okay.
And maybe even experiencing a sense of like personal elevation through that connection.
So it's not selfless devotion.
Not in the traditional sense.
It's about like a dynamic where you're kind of asserting a value.
Right. It's about strength and affirmation and choosing.
That sounds very detached.
It can be. Yeah.
And, it makes sense when you think about like his quote from Leibniz.
Oh, yeah.
I despise almost nothing.
Right. And he even describes himself as someone who doesn't easily say yes or no.
So he keeps a distance.
Yeah, there's a real tendency in Nietzsche toward broad acceptance and critical observation rather than like immediate emotional engagement.
So does that tie into this like kind of detached perspective he has on like passionate love?
Yeah, I think so. I think for Nietzsche, passionate love has the potential to cloud judgment and hinder that objective assessment that he values.
So he's like observing love, analyzing it,
right,
not necessarily like immersing himself in it.
Exactly.
This is where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay.
He talks about like the philosopher's love being potentially constrained and artificial, a tour de force, rather than this natural outpouring of feeling that God, woman, and animal understand.
Yeah.
Like, what is he getting at there?
I think he's getting at the idea that the philosopher, in striving for this like intellectual rigor, might experience or cultivate love in a very consciously controlled way.
So it's like an act of will almost.
Yeah, the tour de force suggests that
like you're constructing a feeling rather than just like letting it flow.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with what he sees as a more natural instinctual emotion in others.
Okay, so, and he's very critical of traditional morality.
Of course.
Especially like Christian influence morality, which he saw his life denying.
Right. Emphasizing weakness and pity.
And so how does that skepticism tie into his views on love?
Yeah.
Particularly like self-sacrificing love.
I think for Nietzsche, that emphasis on self-denial is seen as hindering the full expression of the will to power. So traditional notions of love that involve self-sacrifice, putting others first, that would likely be viewed very critically as expressions of this slave morality that he opposes.
Because it's weakening the individual.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, in The Birth of Tragedy, he talks about the Dionysian and the Apollonian rite.
Yes.
Like this primal ecstatic force versus the realm of order and illusion.
Right, two fundamental forces.
Totally. So could passionate love be seen as fitting into either of those for Nietzsche?
It's a good question. I mean, the ecstatic boundary-dissolving aspects of intense love might initially seem very Dionysian.
Yeah, for sure.
But Nietzsche also cautioned against unchecked primal forces. So I think he might argue for a more Apollonian shaping and control of even those passionate emotions.
To kind of prevent a loss of self.
Right. You don't want to lose yourself in irrationality or dependence.
And then there's this whole thing with Zarathustra and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and his desire for another love after being rejected by his followers.
Right. A really interesting concept.
What is that other love about?
Well, it's generally understood as a love that's less about neediness, more about affirmation, and a higher form of valuing. It's a love that respects the other's will to power, avoids possessiveness, and can endure even without reciprocation.
So it's coming from a place of strength?
Yeah, exactly.
And finally, how does the whole concept of the Superman, this individual who transcends conventional morality, relate to a Nietzschean idea of love?
Well, I think the love of the Superman would mirror his strength and self-mastery. It wouldn't be rooted in weakness or resentment, but would be a life-affirming and potentially very generous force, flowing from a place of fulfillment and power.
It's a pretty distinct picture from Nietzsche.
Definitely.
Now let's turn to Dostoevsky. If Nietzsche's valuing this detachment, Dostoevsky, I feel like, just like plunges us into the mess.
Absolutely.
He often painful, but deeply human reality of love.
Right. His novels are a deep dive into the human psyche.
Totally.
And love in his world is rarely simple or straightforward.
No.
It's entangled with suffering, humiliation, obsession, all these intense internal conflicts.
Yeah, a very different view.
Yeah, a stark contrast to that Nietzschean observation.
Okay, so let's look at some examples.
Okay.
Goyadkin in The Double, with his obsessive actions.
Right.
What is that telling us about Dostoevsky's view of love?
Well, I think Goyadkin's behavior, which is likely driven by these deep social anxieties, illustrates how the yearning for connection can become really distorted and destructive when it gets mixed with insecurity and a fragile sense of self-worth.
So love can be a source of torment.
In this twisted form, yeah.
Okay, what about the narrator Eliza in Notes from Underground?
Oh, that's a fascinating one.
So complex, so much push and pull.
Right, so many power struggles and failed attempts at genuine connection.
What's the takeaway there?
I think Dostoevsky is really exploring the darker sides of love there.
Okay.
We see that desire for intimacy clashing with wounded pride and an inability to truly give and receive love.
So even those moments of tenderness, they're overshadowed by all this anxiety?
Yeah, and cynicism.
Dostoevsky doesn't paint love as entirely bleak, though, right?
No, it's definitely not.
Like there's Natasha and Alyosha humiliated and insulted.
Yes, they offer a glimpse of love's resilience and its capacity for healing. Yeah.
Even amidst hardship and betrayal, love endures for them.
Leads to forgiveness.
Right, and renewed trust, a much more optimistic side of love.
And what about familial love?
Yeah.
Makar Alexievich's devotion in Poor Folk.
Yes.
Or even the Underground Man's thoughts on family.
Right. I think those examples show the variety of forms that love takes for Dostoevsky.
Okay.
From quiet, selfless devotion within families to the really complex considerations of responsibility and potential happiness associated with children.
And then there's Sonia in Crime and Punishment.
Ah, Sonia?
Her devotion to Raskolnikov seems like it's key to his redemption.
Right. Her love is portrayed as so unwavering and her sacrifice so profound that it becomes this transformative force.
Wow.
It's powerful enough to draw him back from this moral abyss he's fallen into.
So love has this potential for moral renewal.
Absolutely.
And even seemingly conventional relationships like the engagement in The Idiot.
Right.
Dostoevsky seems to hint at deeper complexities there, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, even seemingly happy and suitable unions often have these hidden currents and underlying motivations. Dostoevsky is always probing beneath the surface to reveal the real emotional landscape of those relationships.
And the Underground Man's yearning for a holy mystery within marriage.
Yeah.
What is that about?
I think despite all of his cynicism,
Yeah.
that yearning reveals a deep longing for genuine lasting intimacy.
Okay.
Within marriage, he sees it as something sacred and private, offering solace from the harshness of the world.
So the contrast is so clear.
It really is.
Nietzsche approaching love with this critical, almost detached eye, focused on self-overcoming. Dostoevsky immersing himself in the often painful, but ultimately human experience.
Right.
Do you think Nietzsche would see Dostoevsky's characters as embodying that slave morality that he critiques?
It's highly likely. I think his focus on strength and self-reliance would lead him to see those characters, often driven by such intense emotional turmoil, as examples of the weakness he associates with that morality.
And conversely, do you think Dostoevsky might view Nietzsche's Superman as lacking in some essential human qualities?
I think he might, especially given his emphasis on compassion and the interconnectedness of humanity. He might see that ideal individual taken to an extreme as potentially isolated and lacking in the experience that comes through empathy and vulnerability and love.
This has been a really fascinating look at these contrasting views.
Yeah, definitely.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener.
Okay.
In your own life, which perspective resonates more? Nietzsche's emphasis on self-mastery and a maybe more self-contained form of love, or Dostoevsky's exploration of love's vulnerability and its capacity for both immense joy and profound suffering?
It's a big question.
Is there a way to find a balance between these two seemingly opposing views?
I think both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky offer us valuable frameworks for understanding the complexities of love, and reflecting on their contrasting ideas can offer some really profound insights into our own experiences.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Nietzsche and Dostoevsky on love.
Absolutely.
We encourage you to revisit their work with these contrasting perspectives in mind.
For sure.
and, continue your own exploration of this intricate world of love.
It's worth it.
Until next time.
See you then.